When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come, make gods for us, who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Aaron said to them, "Take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them, formed it in a mold, and cast an image of a calf, and they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a festival to the Lord." They rose early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought sacrifices of well-being, and people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to revel. The Lord said to Moses, "Go down at once. Your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have acted perversely. They have been quick to turn aside from the way that I commanded them. They have cast for themselves an image of a calf, and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it, and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.'" The Lord said to Moses, "I have seen this people, how stiff-necked they are. Now let me alone, so that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and of you I will make a great nation." But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, "O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, 'It was with evil intent that he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth'? Turn from your fierce wrath, change your mind, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, how you swore to them by your own self, saying to them, 'I will multiply your descendants like the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever.' And the Lord changed his mind about the disaster that he planned to bring on his people." I wonder if you can recall a time that you were overcome by a feeling of separation anxiety. Maybe when you were younger, and at one moment as a child you had your parent in view, but as you turned around and did some other things, and you turned back and you realized they were no longer in view. At one moment they were within reach, and another moment they were no longer within reach, and the anxiety that comes with that. I can recall a time myself when I was a child. I was at a store with my mother, and I had this habit as a kid of wanting to hide. I like to hide in the clothing racks, the circular clothing racks. And I was comfortable with that most often because I knew that my mom was just on the other side of those clothes. She was within reach. Until one occasion when I can vividly remember the experience of stepping out of that clothing rack, but from behind those clothes, and not seeing my mom, not having her anywhere within view, and realizing that while I thought she was within reach, she really wasn't. And I can remember the feeling of being frozen by that sense of anxiety, of needing to know where my mom was at. This story today that we hear in Exodus 32 is a familiar story. It's a story of the golden calf. And I think at the heart of the story is in many ways is this universal human experience of separation anxiety, being separated from someone we love and care for, and thinking they are within reach and then realizing they're not within reach, and the anxiety that comes with that. You see, where we jump into the story today, the Israelites, they don't know what has happened to God and to Moses. It's been some 40 days since God and Moses left and went up to Mount Sinai, and Moses was receiving the tablets there on the mountain from God. But the people down below, the Israelites, they're beginning to wonder if Moses and God will ever come back. They don't know what's happened to Moses. And you may remember, they've gotten pretty used to having tangible signs of God's presence to them and with them. They've been used to having someone like Moses who serves as a mediator between them and God. Moses was himself a very tangible sign that God was present with them, that God was still leading them. And now Moses was gone. You may recall earlier in the book of Exodus, as the Israelites were fleeing from Egypt, that God would lead them by a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire during the night. Again, these are very visible, tangible manifestations, signs of God's presence to them and with them, that God was still within reach. But now, some 40 days have gone by, and they've been without any signs, any tangible signs of God's presence. They're beginning to wonder if God will ever be within reach again. And so what they do is, while it's wrong, it's understandable. It's a very human thing that they do. They create an idol that will remind them, that will assure them that God is still within reach. They create this golden calf. And, typical interpretations of the story kind of go like this. A lot of interpreters will say that this is a story where the Israelites have created with the golden calf a completely different God. It's a completely different God from Yahweh, the God who led them out of Egypt. But there are other interpreters who provide a different account, and I find it a bit more persuasive. Other interpreters say that it's more likely that the Israelites, instead of creating an image of a completely different God to worship, they were creating an idol, a representation, if you will, that would point them to God, to Yahweh, to the God that led them out of Egypt. That this golden calf would serve kind of like Moses served to them. Someone that mediated God's presence, that reminded them that God was within reach, that was present to them and with them in that moment. You see, it all kind of comes down to the way a certain word gets translated in the text. In our English Bibles, the word for gods, when the Israelites come to Aaron and say, "Make for us gods who will go before us," that word gods comes from the Hebrew word Elohim. And Elohim is just another name for God in the Hebrew Bible. And other interpreters, they point out that Elohim can be equally translated in a singular fashion or in a plural fashion. It can be either singular or plural. And most English Bibles translate Elohim in this passage in a plural way. It makes it seem like the Israelites are asking for different gods than Yahweh, than their God. But other interpreters make the case, and I find it to be more persuasive, that it's likely they weren't asking for other gods, but they wanted something that would point to Yahweh, that would remind them that God was still within reach. So they bring their gold to Aaron. He makes the golden calf, and he presents it to them. And what do the people say? They say, "Look, this is the God who brought us up out of Egypt." If we translate Elohim there in the singular fashion, it kind of makes sense that this is the God that brought us up out of Egypt. It's a representation of Yahweh. Now, this is where the Israelites kind of go wrong. It's a natural thing that they like to do, but it's not really that their sin is that they are worshiping a different God, but instead that they are creating an image of God, which is something God said not to do. That they didn't need an image to mediate God. And so this golden calf that they create, while it's kind of off base, it's understandable. We might call this an idol of the familiar. A golden calf is an idol of the familiar because it creates God, this mysterious creator God, in the image of the familiar. It creates God in a way that boils God down, that pins God down, locates God in a particular place that we can touch, see, and feel. So it's an idol of the familiar. And it's familiar in a couple different ways. The first is just with the material that gets used to make the golden calf. You may remember earlier in the story, as the Israelites are getting ready to flee from Egypt, God tells the Israelites to go ahead and ask their Egyptian neighbors for some gifts, for some gold and other goods that they can send them on their way with. And these are the gold pieces that the Israelites offer up today in the story to Aaron. They had held on to them from their escape from Pharaoh's army. And so it's this familiar material that they use from their days in Egypt to create this idol. It's an idol of the familiar. It's familiar in another way. It's familiar in the image that gets used. The image of the golden calf itself was a familiar image from their culture in the area of Egypt that they were coming from. It's often the case in the ancient world of this time, in ancient Egypt, for example, that gods were often associated with bulls and calves and other bovine sorts of animals. It was often the case that an image would show a god standing on top of a bull, that the bull was kind of a footstool for the deity. So this is a familiar image that they are using to create this idol that would remind them of their God who sits here upon this idol, in the same way that Egyptian gods may have sat upon their idols. And so it's an idol of the familiar. Now this is a very human impulse that we have, because it reflects all of our propensities toward separation anxiety and kind of what we do to assure ourselves in the face of that sort of anxiety. The Israelites were asking a question that many of us find ourselves asking today. Questions like, when and where and how will God show up in our lives next? Will God show up to us? Will God ever be present to us again? These are questions that we find ourselves asking throughout our lives of faith. And a lot of that has to do with our uncomfortability with mystery. God as a mysterious God, it's often, that mystery of God is often too much to handle. The mystery of God is too uncertain. It's not dependable. It's not definable. We can't put it in our pocket. We can't touch and feel it and see it. It's hard to put barriers around and to define it and to understand it. And so we want to know that God is within reach, that God can be located, that God can be pinned down, that God can be easily understood, that God is within reach. And so we, like the Israelites, we often tend to create God in the image of what's familiar. We create God in the image of the familiar. For example, white Christians have been known to like to paint pictures of Jesus, not as a brown-skinned Palestinian Jew from the first century, but instead as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Euro-American man. We create God in the image of the familiar. We often create Jesus, in another example, Jesus, who we know as the Lamb of God in the Scriptures. Instead, we recreate him in the image of an elephant or of a donkey. This is especially true in an election season like the one in which we find ourselves now. We recreate Jesus, who we know in the Scriptures as the Prince of Peace, as some kind of military commander who sanctions and quenches our thirst for war. We create God in the image of the familiar. We recreate this boundless, mysterious God in oftentimes the familiar image of church buildings and rules and committees and codes and all the things that make up the institution of the church. And so this boundless God, this source of all life, this free-flowing spirit that enlivens all of creation becomes church-bound, bound to a particular place inside a certain set of walls. But here's the thing, friends, that creating God in the image of the familiar, while it's understandable, while it makes sense, it's very human, what it does is flattens God for us. Creating God in the image of the familiar, it limits God. It reduces God to what we think we already know, rather than what God wishes to show us, rather than how God wishes to challenge us, to stretch us, to surprise us. We must acknowledge here in this story that God is way more mysterious and way more surprising than any idol we can conjure up. So there's an invitation in this story for us as followers of Jesus to, instead of creating God in the image of the familiar, instead opening ourselves up to curiosity and opening ourselves up to surprises. Because the God, as Christians, we believe that the God revealed in Jesus was then and still is now a surprising God. There's an invitation here, friends, to be surprised by the God revealed in Jesus, who came not to be served, but to serve, who came not as a prince, but as a peasant. The God revealed in Jesus, who identified not with power, but with the powerless, who befriended sinners, not the self-professed saints, who cared not for those who saw no sickness in themselves, but instead those who knew their own sickness. The God revealed in Jesus, who taught not self-seeking greed, but instead self-emptying love. This is a surprising God. So friends, let us forsake our idols of the familiar. Instead, take the invitation to open ourselves up to the God of surprises who's revealed to us in Jesus Christ. Amen.